Night of the Basilisk by L.C. Holt. Read for you by the author. 6 p.m. Some things you don't forget, the old man said, stoking his pipe. The eyes of my first love, the sound of her voice, these things have been lost to time. It's only natural, Lomax assured. You've been alive a century plus one. A memory or two is bound to fade. Why the hell am I here? Was what the attorney was actually thinking. We could shoot the shit over the phone. The only reason he'd dropped by was because the miser had mentioned adding an addendum to his will. Having redrafted the document to make himself sole beneficiary, Lomax was curious what the man had in mind. Listen, Hobbs said, an uncharacteristic curtness in his voice, before I lose the nerve to tell you. I've kept this secret all my life. I can't keep it anymore. He paused, the carnival glass beside him casting shades of blue and green over his withered features. A dry fire crackled in the hearth. The house was otherwise dark. My daddy built this place with money pilfered from the church. He was the reverend in this town before age stole his last breath. He was also a monster to me, my brother, and most of all my mother. She was 14 when they married. Times were different then. I remember when I was a child, we used to keep a burlap sack of salt on the porch. Whenever she passed by, she'd lick her finger and get some. One day he caught her, held her down, and shoved fistfuls into her mouth till she started foaming like a mad dog. He didn't spare the rod with us either. We'd get it just because we were there. He used to do revival meetings all over the South, be gone weeks at a time. It was during one of those trips I heard my mother one night screaming in her sleep. She came down the next morning with strands of white in her hair. That was the start of her decline. My daddy came home and saw the state she was in, asked what happened. She kept her lips sealed with him, but she told me. She said something had come into her room and had its way with her. I thought she was fooling till she started to show. This house, as it is now, is pretty far from the beaten track. Back then, it took the better part of an hour to get to town. My daddy, the old man hesitated, he thought my mother and brother had, I guess you could say, lain together. When the baby was born, it seemed to confirm that. That child, you see, was deformed. The way it came out, my mother had no chance of surviving. It was... The story was cut short by a scuffling in the wall. Hobbs's eyes skirted to the stairwell. So sorry, he said. Where was I? Your mother died in childbirth. That's right, but the baby didn't, at least not at first. We used to have a box of kindling. My daddy put the newborn in it, wrapped it in chains, and gave it to me to bury. It was better, he said, for folks to think the child died with its mother than to see how horrible it looked. So I took it down cellar and buried it in the sacred earth of Coweta County. You buried it alive? Hobbs winced at the question. I was 13 years old. I didn't know no better. But that don't make it right. Life went on for a while. My daddy played the part of the lamented husband. My brother took the brunt of his abuse till he upped and joined the Navy. He died at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. My daddy lived to be 91, thriving the whole time. That's the nature of the world. The brave die while the weak and wicked go on and on and on. There is no order to things. No God, no Satan, only us and the horrors we create. His eyes locked on the stairwell. Something thumped on the plaster with enough force to knock an aged photo of his mother and father askew. Damn rats, Lomax thought, as Hobbs gave him an envelope, which was only to be read on the day of his death. Considering his dwindling health, he had lost a leg to diabetes, and most of his vision to glaucoma, that day was speedily approaching. Setting his pipe aside, Hobbs rose on his prosthetic limb and hobbled to the kitchen. Another, louder, thwack sent a shower of plaster dust down from the ceiling. "What the hell is that?" Lomax said, as he pivoted to see a fissure forming at the floor and spreading upward. The impact which followed could hardly be called a thump. The photo jarred loose and shattered. Lomax was now on his feet, peering into the kitchen to see the old man with a gun to his temple. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Let's face it," the man replied. "I'm too weak, too sick, too—" He lowered his head and pulled the trigger. Lomax winced as the wall beneath the staircase exploded, sending splinters of wood pulp flying. One struck him in the bridge of the nose, knocking off his glasses and causing his eyes to water. He was now on his hands and knees, lost in a short-sighted blur, his breath hitching on air thick with dust. A man-sized maw gaped in the drywall. He found his broken glasses and peered through to see a duplet of wiry arms folding from the dark gulf of a hidden doorway. A pair of long-fingered hands, tipped in talons, found purchase and pulled. From the shadowy cellar came a long, lean figure. Even with its shoulders slumped, it stood 8 or 9 feet tall. From the crest of its swollen scalp hung irregular tufts of black hair. Its left eye bulged bloodshot. Its right was sewn to a slit by seeping pus. It was naked, the lattice work of its ribs chiseled in high relief to its protruding pelvis. Its arms and legs were twice the length of a normal man's. The same could be said of its sex, which jostled as it took one step, then another, traversing the room in a single gait. It wasn't until the beast was looming over Lomax that he realized its body was alive with creepy crawlers. Spiders nested beneath its skin, burrowing dens beneath every furrow. Lice seethed in its knotted hair as worms slithered under its tongue. What are you?" Lomax stuttered. "Basilisk," the beast answered, each syllable riding on a fetid breath. From the blackness of its gums appeared hundreds of needle-like teeth, unsheathing like the claws of a cat. "Greed," it said, as ropes of saliva dribbled onto the attorney's brow. A heartbeat later it lunged, and that was the story of Sonny Lomax. 6:25 p.m. Brian was glad to be out of that monkey suit. He could only imagine how Faye must feel. Wedding dresses looked so heavy and cumbersome. They had just entered the police jurisdiction of Robinson Springs, and were now perusing the twinkle-light-embellished houses on their way to the quaint bed and breakfast where they'd spend their honeymoon. The newlyweds had first met 3 years prior, when Brian was an assistant floor installer. He was laying linoleum at the dorm where she lived when their eyes met across the room. She was now a senior, majoring in history, while he manned an earth mover at the rock quarry. He was a roughneck and she the daughter of a city councilman. Their life together was going to be arduous, but love would see them through, or so they hoped. "Honky-tonk," she said, pointing to an especially garish Christmas display. The B&B, by contrast, was elegant. They were soon pulling their bags from the back of Brian's pickup. A boy in a hooded coat stood pointing and talking to the grass a few yards away. By the time the two of them had reached the wraparound porch of the rambling Victorian, the front door had opened, and out came a kindly old woman with blue helmet hair. "Sit," the boy could be heard saying. "Stay." The matron, whose name was Laureen Harper, said, "Don't mind him, he's just talking to his imaginary dog. I told him, Ansel, I'm not cleaning up after a filthy pet, so he made one up." Cupping her hands around her mouth, she called for her grandson to come in out of the cold. He turned, a sodium lamp illuminating his slant eyes and flattened nose, 2 physical characteristics denoting Down syndrome. "Say hello to our guests," Lorraine prompted as he bounded up the stairs. "Hello," he said, and was gone a moment later. "Cute," Faye crooned, as they followed their host into the warm foyer. Through the living room door she spied an enormous pipe organ. "Do you play?" she asked. "I do indeed," Lorraine replied, "both here and at the church." Handing Brian their room key, she winked. "There might be a little surprise for y'all upstairs. Have fun." "Thanks," Brian said as they ascended. "Maybe she left us her French tickler," he said to Faye, who shushed him. Down the hall they found the honeymoon suite. Faye took the key and motioned for the door. "Wait," Brian told her. "You can't just walk in." "Huh? Oh." She rolled her eyes and offered herself to be carried. Brian swept her up and over the threshold, where they found a spacious room with its own fireplace. On the table by the bed they discovered their surprise: a bottle of champagne, chilling in a bucket of ice. "I hope you're not too disappointed," she said. "No sex toys." "Would have been more fun. Now, if only I had a corkscrew. That can be fixed. We've passed the dollar store on the way here." "Not so fast," she said, hooking him by the belt and pulling him forward. "Silly me," he grinned, and kicked the door closed. 7 p.m. Moira had lusted for Lyle Burkett since they were in high school. After 33 years of unrequited love, it was he who came to her, asking if she'd mind keeping an eye on his house. "Any funny business," he said, "call me, but not at the station." Lyle was chief of police, and his wife was a backup dispatcher. She had friends in the department who might cover for her, he assumed. As for a definition of funny business, Moira needed none. Not with the plumber's van at the curb and Joy wearing so skimpy a negligee. "Hush!" she called to her corgis, who had been barking at the back door for what seemed like an hour. James Deem, the Pembroke Welsh, came plodding in, followed by Elvis and Brando. They lingered at her feet, sniffing her slippers. Moira, who was the local librarian, had garnered a reputation for being a spinster, either that or a lesbian. In truth, she only had eyes for one man, and he was married to a chick half his age. Joy was gorgeous, that was undeniable. She had blonde hair, alabaster skin, and blue eyes flecked green. Moira, by comparison, was tall and angular, with a hook nose and buck teeth. She was wearing plaid pajamas under a flannel robe tied at the waist with curlers in her hair. Joy had on a see-through teddy. "Slut," Moira scoffed, the edge in her voice eliciting a bark from Brando. The dogs were now padding away. A moment later they resumed their yapping, but by then Moira was holding her cell phone, debating whether or not to warn Lyle. She chose to keep her word and composed a text. "He's here," it read plainly. Raising her binoculars, she was now in the bedroom with Joy and the plumber. They had yet to copulate, though clearly it wasn't far off. The distaste she felt was palpable. Some people had all the luck, born with a body to kill for, eyes like ice chips, and a smile so straight and clean it'd cause any man to swoon. It was a crime of the cosmos, she determined, that women like Joy could get anything they wanted while she remained a perpetual virgin. At 46, she had little hope of conceiving a child. "Oh well," she said aloud, turning away from the window before things got sexual. That was one sight she did not want to see. It was only then she realized the dogs had stopped barking. She crossed the bedroom, went down the hall, and pushed through the back door. Her Marlboros lay on the porch railing beside a tan Bic lighter. She picked up both and lit a cigarette to mull over her lot in life. That's when she saw a flicker of fire through the treetops and a column of dark smoke rising against the night sky. "Shit," she muttered, realizing the source of the fire must be Hobbs's house. She had left her cell on her bed, so she darted for the kitchen landline. The receiver was in her hand when the heady stench of rot stung her nostrils. Someone was in the house. She could feel their eyes upon her. A silhouette swelled in the dining room, too tall to be human, and a pair of gray, two-toed feet stepped into the light, followed by a hulking form. The cigarette dangling from her mouth fell as her bladder voided. Brando? She muttered. The corgi's leg twitched between the beast's teeth. It threw back its head, swallowing the last of the canine in a single gulp. Now, she was its sole target. Envy, it growled, as its incisors bisected her skull. What was left of her head squirted blood as it chewed, spitting out one curler, then another, and another, and another. 8 p.m. Lyle had duties to fulfill, in spite of the rage incited by his neighbor's text. A blaze at Mr. Hobbs's place had reduced the 4-storied gabled mansion to smoldering embers. Murder was the most likely motive, with a pinch of arson to cover it up. There was a gnawed leg in the driveway. It didn't take the deductive reasoning of Sherlock Holmes to determine the gam did not belong to Phineas. A run of the Beamer's plates revealed its owner to be Samuel Lomax, known in town as Sonny, a local probate attorney. The question was, who had killed him in so appalling a manner? Lyle was too angry to care. The irony of his current situation was not lost. He'd traded in his wife of 15 years for a younger model. Was her cheating divine retribution? Maybe so. That didn't mean he had to bow to it. Not after all the hours he'd spent in the gym, keeping himself sharp and in shape. He'd always known it would be a challenge maintaining her interest, but he thought between his libido and bank account that'd be easily accomplished. Perhaps he had underestimated his prowess, but then again, Joy had never been able to keep her thighs together, or so the rumor went. In his wild arrogance, he assumed he could change her. The county boys finally arrived, with Sheriff Mullins leading the charge. With him on the scene, Lyle had an opportunity to break away. Luckily, his house was right through the woods, a 10-minute drive at most. Sure enough, a white work van was parked at the curb. Lyle inspected the clip in his pearl-handled Colt 9mm, kicked open the door of his cruiser, and crossed the lawn. He entered to find the living room lighted by a Christmas spruce, its ornaments sparkling red and green. There were a pair of discarded shit-kickers at the bottom of the stairs and a woman's ankle sock halfway up. Lyle followed a din of grunts into the bedroom, where he found a man's sallow ass thrusting. He cleared his throat, at which point the plumber's eyes grew saucer-wide, his lips working at words that wouldn't come. Joy broke the silence by saying, "Don't overreact, Lyle. We were just..." Her reply was cut short by a gunshot to the carpet. "What the fuck are you doing?" she demanded. "Marking my territory," Lyle said, turning back to the plumber, whose name was Denny Schofield. "Did you really think you could get away with this? Man, if so, you either have rocks in your head or brass in your balls. Judging from the way your lips quivering, I think I know the answer." Denny said he was sorry. "If you got caught stealing a dilly bar from the Dairy Queen, I might accept your apology. But you dipped your chip in my wife. Sorry don't cut it." He raised his pistol to the plumber's face. "I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Answer them honestly and you'll walk. How long has this been going on?" When Denny replied 6 months, Lyle inquired, "Who initiated it, you or her?" "She did." "I buy that," Lyle said. "Now listen to me, friend. If I let you leave up out of here, are you going to do this again?" He answered, as predicted, "No." "I don't believe that for a second. But still, I'm going to give you a head start. Now get your naked ass out of my house." The plumber grabbed his clothes. "What'd I tell you? I said get your naked ass out of my house. Leave your wallet, leave your keys and phone, go on foot." Denny, at first confused, dropped everything and ran. "Alone at last," Lyle told his wife. "Okay," she rolled her eyes. "What do you want?" He put his gun to her head. "To see you beg," he grinned. 8:30 p.m. Never in a million years did Denny think he'd be running, bare-assed, down a dark country road on a chilled night with the chief of police pursuing him. It seemed appropriate that his Dick would be his downfall. Denny, who had never broken the law, had broken many a heart with his man-whoring. Unfortunately, the cop now breathing down his neck was immune to his innocent-eyed charm. Headlights rounded the corner half a mile down the road. A spotlight affixed to the cruiser's door scanned the tree line. Denny ran for cover, his boots thumping on the asphalt, then crunching on dead leaves and limbs. He kneeled behind a pine and prickle bush, watching as the chief's vehicle idled this way. The searchlight found him trembling. The chief's amplified voice told him to come out and face the music. A countdown followed, ending with Denny on his feet, ambling into the road with his head lowered. "You look like shit run over twice," Lyle said, getting out of his car. The engine purred, a pillar of white vapor rising from the rear. He had a set of cuffs in his hand and gouts of blood on his shirt. "Turn around," he ordered. "Please," Denny begged through chattering teeth, but the chief was unmoved. Seconds later, he was on his knees, his hands cuffed behind him. Lyle unholstered his Colt and showed it to the plumber, his fingers unfurling to reveal a name etched on its pearl grip. "What's that say?" he asked. "Kumi?" Denny read. "Unusual name, ain't it? Not one you hear often. I'm going to tell you a little story about a fella named Prentice Oakley. He was sheriff in Beanville Parish, Louisiana. But prior to that, he participated in one of the most important ambushes in American history. It was 1934. There was not a soul who didn't know the names Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. Henderson Jordan, who was sheriff at that time, got word they were heading his way, and so he put together a posse which included Prentice. They lay in wait until the Barrows Ford came shimmying down the road, and then they jumped out and emptied every round they had into the car. Prentice, being the first man there, got his pick of souvenirs. He took Barrow's gun, and when he died, it passed to his middle girl, and when she died, it passed to me. Prentice Oakley was my grandfather, and this pistol was his prized possession. I imagine you're wondering how I know it's really Clyde Barrow's gun. I did some research and come to find out Clyde's mother's name was Kumi," Denny put together. "That's right. So the question I have for you is, how honored are you to know your dick's about to get blown off by Clyde Barrow's gun?" "No," Denny croaked. All the emotion of the past half hour was running down his cheeks in warm rivers. He could hear the chief laughing as his shoulders racked. Then, glancing up, the plumber saw something at first obscured by the cruiser's exhaust. A squall of chilly wind cleared the vapor. Now he could see in all its glory the spindly shape of a man watching the duo from beneath the road's only street lamp. Was it a man? He looked impossibly tall, his elongated arms too grotesque to be human. The chief followed his quarry's gaze. "What the hell?" he murmured, as it took one step, then another, gaining speed until it was loping toward them fast as a freight train. Lyle raised his storied weapon and fired, striking the beast square in the chest. An initial spurt of blood eased to a trickle. The unfazed creature caught Lyle by the arm and twisted, shredding every tendon from wrist to shoulder. The chief howled as it took his head and turned it round. Denny winced at the sound of the man's brittle neck breaking. "Wrath," the monster cried into the night. If Denny had any hope of surviving, he'd have to get his hands in front of him. While the creature was preoccupied, he contorted his limbs, laboring to get them down and around his feet. He kept his eyes fixed on the beast, who was now chucking Lyle's body to and fro like a rag doll. Broad slashes of red blood hit the pavement and steamed, transforming the street into a canvas of macabre art. When the beast had bored of its exhibition, it tossed Burkett into the air, letting him fall to the ground with a watery crack. By then, Denny was in the cruiser, its warmth thawing his frozen flesh. He dropped the transmission into drive, but it was too late. Clawed hands exploded through the windshield. Talons dug into tender flesh, and now he was staring into the barbarian's pitted face. "Lust," it snarled, as the feeding began. 9 p.m. Earl Scruggs was the groundskeeper of the First Baptist Church. He lived in a shanty out back full of gardening supplies and small engine parts. Tonight he was lounging on his bed with a space heater humming near his feet. On TV, Jimmy Stewart was running through the streets of Bedford Falls telling everyone who would listen Merry Christmas. Earl dug hungrily into the bag of Fritos balancing on his lap and shoveled a handful into his mouth. Several ended up either on his wife-beater or on the stained thighs of his blue jeans. As he gathered them up, he noticed the dry crackle of leaves outside. "Son of a bitch," he said. Putting his chips aside, he went to the window and glanced out to see a shadow wandering the graveyard. He knew who it was. Ansel. "Little potato head," he spat, as he grabbed his coat and flashlight and strode out into the dark. The boy was standing under an oak tree when Earl found him, staring into its canopy. He shouted, "Hey!" at which point the boy took off in a hurry. What had been holding his attention so rapt? Earl hiked over, using his flashlight to examine the tree. Though mostly leafless, beards of Spanish moss swayed from every limb. Beyond that, all he could see was gray bark seething with black spiders. Wait a second. The bark was supposed to be brown. He leaned closer and noticed that what he assumed was the oak's hide was actually a thin coat of sweating flesh. There was an animal hiding up there. He raised the beam to get a better look, a decision he'd soon regret. The light described an elephantine head and scarlet eye. Bestial features pulled into a salivating snarl, revealing rows of hypodermic teeth. "Oh, God," Earl managed. "Jesus God," he repeated, then broke for the shanty. He could hear it pursuing, though he dared not turn until he was safely inside. The door had no lock, so he blocked it with a heavy shelf. The creature banged, the walls rattled. Never had Earl so wished for one of those newfangled phones. Screaming would have to suffice, and so he screamed until his throat was raw. There was a light on in the vestry, the Reverend's office. Was Terwilliger so deaf he couldn't hear the roof being torn off a corrugated steel shed? The heater had canted on its side and caught the bedding on fire. Earl was less afraid of flames than of the demon reaching in. It clutched his arm and pulled so hard the socket tore. He was yelling, not from fear but pain. His cries so loud they drowned out the beast's declaration, "Sloth." 9:10 p.m. "Reverend," a voice called from the outer hall. John Terwilliger shot bolt upright. "Heidi?" he said, not to her, but to the guy between his legs. These late-night trysts with Mark Gleason, the church's music minister, were made possible by a bald-faced lie. Not a single song for Sunday services were ever selected during their evenings together, though plenty of sword-swallowing was demonstrated. "Under the desk," he ordered as the door opened. "Good evening," he told Heidi. "I didn't know you were coming by." She saw the bottle of Bacardi on the blotter. "Would you look at what I confiscated from Pat Welsh? Can you believe that rascal, bringing rum to a youth group?" In truth, the liquor was used to lubricate his lover's inhibitions. Gleason put on a good front for the public, but get a good stiff drink in him and he became a flamin' queen. "So, what can I do for you?" he asked. According to Heidi, her boyfriend was having an affair with the chief of police's wife. "Denny didn't come home," she said. "I drove past the Burkett's place and there was his van parked outside. I don't know what else to do." "You've done enough," he told the girl as he coaxed her out into the hall. "A sweetheart like you could have any choice of eligible men. Let me tell you what my mother used to say. Never bet on a loser." "So what you're saying is I should—" "Drop him," the Reverend advised. They were now in the foyer, heading for the door. It might be difficult, but you've got to do what you've got to do. Okay, she said wanly. Again, I'm sorry for coming over so late. I know you're busy. He told her not to worry about it. A moment before leaving, she said, And Reverend, your fly's unzipped? Oh, he blushed. Oh my. Thank you. She left. Gleason followed soon after, giving his forbidden lover a parting kiss. Another close call had been diverted. The last thing Terwilliger needed was to be outed by a teenager. If the ignorant asses in this town knew he was gay, they would automatically assume he was a child molester. Bacardi awaited, but first he had to lock up and turn off the lights. In the dreariness of the sanctuary, he saw the tremble of flames through the stained glass windows and wondered, was Earl burning trash again? How many times did he have to tell that freeloader he was going to set the church on fire? With the new additions nearing completion, the last thing they needed was for an insurance claim. Terwilliger switched the lights back on, went down the center aisle, and pushed open the door behind the baptismal pool. The fire was immediately evident. It was coming from the groundkeeper's shack, which had been torn asunder and was now spitting smoke. Silhouetted by the flames was a creature, its head jostling back and forth as it tore mouthfuls of flesh from an animal on the ground. The man of the cloth yelled to Earl, which wasn't the smartest move, seeing as how it alerted the behemoth to his presence. The monster stood up, and up, and up, a good 9 feet from the tip of its toes to the crown of its head. Impossible, the Reverend thought, though he couldn't deny the evidence of his eyes. The creature was now pointing a long, taloned finger. Pride, it rasped, as it broke for the door, leaping headstones as it went. He threw closed the portal and bolted the lock, his heart thumping in his chest. A moment later, the beast's body slammed into the ingress, nearly taking it off its hinges. It was then that the Reverend realized the animal at its feet had been Earl. Now he was to be made its next meal. He fled down the aisle as the door succumbed to the force behind it. Kneeling in the hall, he peered around a corner to see the beast lumbering into the sanctuary. It raised its head, sniffing the air before noticing a plaque commemorating the church's founder, Reverend Sigmund Hobbs. Its reaction was one of spleen. It ripped the plaque off the wall and threw it through the closest window. From there it launched into a childish tantrum, flipping pews and scoring the walls with its jagged claws. Terwilliger seized the opportunity to slip into the basement. There was a secondary door on the other side of the cellar if he could navigate its pitch blackness. He didn't hazard the lights for fear they would indicate his hiding place, and so carefully, blindly, he descended. He was not careful enough. His foot missed a step, and now he was tumbling end over end, his head striking the floor with a thud. Then all was dark. All was silent. 9:45 p.m. There was nowhere Brian would rather be than in the arms of his fetching bride. The past 3 hours of lovemaking had made the years they waited worth it. We should have pet names for each other, he suggested. Something cutesy. What do you have in mind? Can I call you the Areola Ayatollah? Not if you expect me to answer. She glanced at the bottle of wine still cooling amidst the melting ice. You think that lady, Miss Harper, has a bottle opener? He said he would check. Don't be too long, she winked. What should have been a simple trip turned out to be far more complicated. After sliding out of bed, Brian donned his jeans and a jacket and strode downstairs. He spied a liquor store on the corner and headed that way, passing the First Baptist Church as he went. There was a coarse old woman, probably a parishioner of the aforementioned church, arguing with the clerk over the price of cognac. She was fit to be tied, refusing to concede no matter how adamantly the counter girl insisted that particular bottle was not on sale. It eventually went to the shelf, where the girl's case was vindicated. That didn't end the woman's prattling. She continued to fuss before finally leaving in a huff. It wasn't until his return trip that Brian noticed the smell of smoke wafting from the west. He shrugged it off. more interested in getting in out of the chill than investigating what was most likely a barbecue. When he finally got back to the house, he saw Lorene on the porch, calling for her grandson. When Brian asked if everything was okay, she said, "He tends to wander. Usually it's easier to find him." Tying the polythene bag to his wrist, Brian followed her across the street, calling the boy's name the whole way. The eastern flank of the church was cordoned off by a temporary chain-link fence. It must have given the work crew constructing the new fellowship hall a measure of comfort to know the equipment they left behind would survive the night unmolested. On the opposite side, a bulkhead door leading to the building's basement swung open, and a shambling man emerged. He was in a state of panic. "I don't have a key to this," he said of the gate, then motioning to the rear of the fence. "There's a gap they never fixed." 10 p.m. Seeing the smoldering shed and the splintered wood door, Brian wondered if there wasn't at least some truth to the Reverend's story. Once they had freed Terwilliger from the construction site, the man dropped to his knees and thanked the Lord. Lorene had spotted her grandson in the graveyard. The Reverend tried to stop her, but with Brian's aid she pushed him away. The nearer they grew to the boy, the more apprehensive Brian became. Ansel was edging toward a yawning grave, pointing and shouting for something to sit and stay. The hole had not been made by heavy equipment, but rather gorged by hand or claw. The tombstone looked as old as the town itself, the name upon it weather-worn. Ebby Rowe Hobbs, it read. Even before he reached the grave, Brian knew the creature within was no imaginary dog. He could smell its putrid stench. What he beheld 6 feet below was far more terrifying than any specter his mind could have conjured. The ungodly fiend had ripped into the departed's coffin and was now eating the remnants of bone and cloth that remained. This banquet was not the equal of its previous. It wasn't devouring its mother because the salt of sin had cured her meat. Rather, it was trying to make her a permanent part of it. It glanced up at Brian and Lorene, loosing a growl from the pit of its soul, if indeed it had one. They backed away as it rose, the distress Brian had recognized in its eyes diminishing. He told Lorene to run. When he turned to shoo her away, the massive creature lurched, seizing him by both sides with its prodigious hands. Claws tore into his down jacket, piercing fabric and flesh as it heaved him up and off the ground. From behind, Lorene let loose a scream, though all Brian could think of was his blushing bride. They'd come so close to happiness only to have it thwarted by a beast from hell. Death seemed imminent until he remembered the bag dangling from his wrist. It was an effort, but he managed to labor through the pain of his punctured skin and tear open the gauze of plastic, closing his hand around the winged corkscrew. Aiming for the most obvious target, he drove the makeshift weapon into the beast's bulging eye and twisted. The creature stumbled, lost its footing, and toppled into the grave. Brian landed on top of it, his head spinning. The fall forced the monster to loose its prey. Ansel, meanwhile, had pulled away from his grandmother and was now standing at the precipice, wiggling his finger and shouting, "Bad boy! Bad boy!" Brian's original assumption was correct. The basilisk was afraid of the child, his innocence being its greatest adversary. With the monster paralyzed, he struggled to free himself of the grave. What he didn't realize was that the Reverend had commandeered the construction crew's cement truck and batter-rammed it through the fence. The mixer was now parallel to the maw, its drum turning. Terwilliger unfolded the chute, but he didn't know how to discharge the concrete. Brian, being a former mason, proffered the direction he needed. Ansel held the demon at bay. It seemed eerily resigned to its fate. The cement splattered, first over the monster's feet, then its legs, then its torso. Brian couldn't believe how sedate it had become. Did it want to die? Or did it know this was only a temporary imprisonment? It studied the sky blindly, the stained corkscrew still protruding from its eye socket. As Terwilliger prayed and prayed and prayed, the mortar filled its mouth, its nose, then covered the balding crown of its head until nothing remained but the occasional air bubble. They filled the crevice to brimming, hoping the weight would either crush or pin it permanently. By the time the final clod fell, Brian succumbed to shock. He would later remember the ambulance ride, though his first real memory was of Faye's fragrant hair in his face. It was the following morning. She was in bed beside him in a room that stank of antiseptic. His lacerations were sutured with no sign of permanent scarring. Raising her head, Faye asked, "Are you okay?" He held her close. "I am now," he said. "What happened?" "I'll tell you about it later. First, let's get the hell out of this town."